I am here today with two fantastic speakers. To my left is Stuart Sandin, who is the director of the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation at Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And to my left is John Payne, who is an ecologist and data scientist. We've talked a lot about advances and technical advancements in artificial intelligence and machine learning today. And we're going to switch things up a little bit in this session and talk a little bit more about applications of artificial intelligence, and specifically how it's being used to promote conservation and how it's being used to advance our understanding of what's going on underwater. So, Stuart, let's start with you. You do a lot of work on coral at Scripps. It's kind of your main deal, I'd say. But I've been reading the news lately, and it's clear to me that all the coral is dying or dead already. So I'm just curious, like, what it is that you actually do.
That's a great question. To summarize it, I try to give corals a voice and coral reefs a voice. Coral reefs as an ecosystem and the people that depend upon them are not all dead. These ecosystems are productive, and there's a lot of variability that currently exists in these coral reef ecosystems. Right now, one of the challenges is the news. The information that we have digitally archived largely reports one of two things for a coral reef. The message you said, the obituary of this ecosystem or some of our other coastal ecosystems. Really tragic news, crises, if you will. The other is talking about this vibrant, splendid diversity, things that cartoons are made of. Well, the reality is somewhere in between. And the biggest problem we have right now is that the reefs themselves don't necessarily have that voice. The people, again, who depend upon them, their stories are not as well documented. And that's what we work to do.
And there's been a lot of adaptation of coral as a species. What have you learned from the coral that you've been studying about resilience and species adaptation?
Yeah, we just finished a campaign, a global campaign, to try to think about the diversity of coral reefs. It was a campaign that we called the 100 Island Challenge. As the name states, it was a campaign to look at coral reefs across all these geographies, across all these different communities. And one of the big things that we were looking for was to see how profound is the loss and where are the places that are the hope spots. And what we found is a whole diversity of cases. Of course, if we dump a bunch of sewage or we take everything out of the water, things are dead. But the other side of the coin was really interesting, and to your point on adaptation. A result that we didn't necessarily expect was that some of these reefs were showing surprising resiliency, even in the face of some of these very overt disruptive events. Hot water events that were killing corals. The next generation would grow back and would grow back stronger.
I've also seen some news about coral. You know, people saying, "Oh, this coral is dying." Actually, it's not dying, it's just migrating, and it's migrating really quickly. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
There are some cases of this shifts in latitude, right? You imagine that if an organism or an ecosystem is adapted to a particular temperature, as that temperature gets warmer at higher latitudes, the organisms can move there. We are seeing some of this tropicalization in places like Korea, Japan. There's some really great case studies. There is some migration. But really importantly, there's within geography migration. We're seeing some of these organisms, the corals themselves, or the organisms that can live in hot water. Maybe they live in a lagoon, but they're now moving to the outer areas where the water is cooler. We're watching this movement and the reorganization like we see on land of trees moving up hillsides. There's a lot of life that's still finding a way to live.
And so that's kind of the coral part of things. Where does the AI come in? What are you trying to do with that?
Yeah. So I can try to tell you a bunch of stories about things that I've seen of coral reefs. You have had this wonderful opportunity to visit a lot of these ecosystems, to work with colleagues in 25 different countries, and to hear those stories. But the big problem is if I come back and just report it in spoken words like I'm doing now, there's a difficulty of translation. There's a difficulty of belief and understanding. We, about a decade ago, turned from just this observational, statistical, or graphing-based approach to an image-based approach. Isn't a picture worth 1,000 words? Well, what if you take thousands of photographs? That's times 1,000, you get a million words, whatever that may be. No, we can create digital twins of underwater environments. And these digital twins, like on land, are these vibrant approaches to see a 3D reconstruction or whatever, this visual analog of the underwater world. And it allows us then to share that information, both for the applications for science, obviously, but across society, people want to see these things. And you'll be able to see some this afternoon. Please do.
Yeah, so we're gonna have your digital twin set up after lunch outside of the main ballroom. What is it that you hope? What is your hope that for this project? Like, how do you imagine it changing the way that people think about coral or the actions that people take?
Yeah, I wanted if we were to go into one of our AI-powered chat machines, and we were to ask the question, what is the condition of coral reefs globally, that we would get a more measured or at least a more representative answer of what's actually happening out there. I firmly believe that the more that we see and the more the stories that my colleagues, again, across the world have these anecdotes of their reefs actually surviving, the more of those stories that are out there, the more we can take those stories and translate them or replicate successes and move away from failures of local management. We can actually keep coral reefs around for the next generation, but we all need to be able to see what's working and understand what's not, and not just throw our hands up that it's all for naught.
You've worked with a lot of local communities all around the world who really depend on the ecosystems and provided by that coral for their livelihood and their food, and it's a part of their identity. What have you learned from those communities that you think the rest of the world should know?
Yeah, the most important story I learned from some of the folks of the foundational importance of storytelling. When we understand ecosystems around us, it's not just a simple set of graphs. If I just show you a graph, it's not that believable. But if I tell you a story of a fish interacting with a coral, or a coral getting killed and the next generation growing back, you make it into something that's more lyrical. It's something that we all learn from. And my Pacific Island colleagues in particular are really good at storytelling. When we got these digital twins presented, what we found was it was a form of storytelling. It was something that enabled us to experience the underwater world, but to be able to talk to one another while we're experiencing it, draining the ocean and then being able to interact with this, and to be able to find some ways that we have shared experiences in what historically has been a very independent, solo thing. When you're underwater, you can't hear and talk. But with a digital twin, we can all interact and we can share, and we can do that across the 8.1 billion people on the planet.
It's amazing. I mean, just, when you think about snorkeling or scuba diving is a very expensive hobby, right? It's not something that many people around the world get to access. And when you think about the impact of actually bringing that to a wider audience, I think it's potentially very exciting. One of the things that I'm just going to say this right now because I really want to see this happen, but I would love to see you all working with NACI to bring hand gesture based, you can control and explore coral with your brain. That would be really, really cool. Are there other technologies or support, this is an audience full of entrepreneurs and technologists, that you could use in your work that you don't have access to now?
Yeah, the type of information that we're working with is consummately usable in the metaverse. Creating a coral reef metaverse is my dream. How could we experience that variability of what is underwater across the globe? They say coral reefs cover an area, it's 0.1% of the ocean floor. It's about the size of France, but it's in a little ribbon that's all around these islands. I drove across France and it's huge. And if you were to take France and make it into a little line, it's gigantic. There's a lot of stories that are in there that people don't get to experience. And like you say, there's the problems of access. There's the problem of comfort in the water. This is whether you live adjacent to the shore or not. But there's this wealth of interest in engaging with the underwater world. But we, right now, depend upon it being this cost-intensive, scuba diving, this or that. There are ways that we can use all the technologies that we're talking about, but create these digital twin of the underwater world in the computer, find ways to interact with it for things as much as fun and putting an avatar and swimming around, through to serious games, trying to engage with different communities to create the databases they need, tracking the efficacy of management or restoration efforts. and all the way through to just some fundamental understanding about how the natural world around us works.
Awesome. I'm very excited about this project. So we're going to switch gears. That's a really good transition to John's focus. So John Payne, many of you in the audience, I think, knew his father, who we sadly lost this year. Roger Payne, who has been with us for many years and has spoken quite a lot about animal communication. What was it like growing up with Roger, and how did that shape the work that you've done? Because clearly there's a little bit of overlap there. And I can empathize, as the child of someone who has a rather outsized personality.
Indeed, yeah. Well, I think anyone who who calls themselves a conservationist has some personal experience with nature that really changes you, and I hear it in you, Stuart. And in my case, my parents figured out that humpback whales sing when I was a kid, and there was no such thing as the Save the Whale movement. And my mother they went on to discover that elephants are communicating all the time at frequencies below human hearing. And I spent a lot of my childhood in Patagonia on the coast, and so it just made me want to. Basically, I became a biologist so that I could have excuse to spend a lot of my time out in wild places. And I've worked in the rainforest in Africa, and I've worked in the Kalahari Desert. I lived with Bushman people for 2 years, and I've spent a couple of years in Mongolia and a number of other places. But sort of to support myself, I've been. I got good at the technical side, the sort of the data analysis and computing and modeling and stuff like that. And for mostly tracking animals and censusing animals, because that's what conservation battles always come down to is questions of, well, what's left? And for the last few years, I've been working on AI, and now I'm really interested in, it sounds very similar to what you're talking about, Stuart, basically messaging. And I see these large language models, and I think, oh, that's a messaging tool.
So say a little bit more about that. When you say messaging, it seems like there's an implicit assumption there about the problem around conservation. Can you articulate that assumption?
Well, I think a lot of conservation is not really an animal problem. When you spend a lot of time around animals, you realize they're well adapted to their environment.
Yeah, the animals are great. It's the humans that are the problem.
Exactly, it's a people problem, and often it's human behaviors and beliefs, attitudes that are driving some sort of big problem that we have. I mean, in the U.S., you see it with climate change. We're talking about increasing the pace of solar energy change. Well, what's in the way? Well, a lot of attitudes and a lot of sort of baggage. In developing countries, there are other attitudes that are much more serious, like the Chinese traditional medicine is emptying forests and oceans all over the world. I mean, pangolin scales, tiger bone, rhino horn, shark fins. The list is very long, and there may be, I'm sure there are certain things about Chinese medicine that are good, but none of those things actually have medicinal value, and they're just incredibly destructive. And so I see those things. I see, this ability to use AI to have natural conversations with people in many different languages as a thing that conservationists haven't grabbed hold of it yet, but I think it's a tool that's going to be very important.
So when you and I spoke before the conference, you mentioned that you thought there was a really interesting opportunity to combine artificial intelligence and messaging with some more nuanced understanding of social science and change science.
Yeah.
How would you see that playing out?
I mean, I think...
And do you know of anyone that's starting to do it or think about it in a meaningful way?
Most of the examples we have of messaging on a big scale are negative. So it's disinformation. That seems to be going very well, and advertising, which is, I guess you could say it's a negative or positive, but it's, anyway, not particularly great for the world. And I just think here we all care about, making change in the world, and making change means changing people's minds. And you look at large language models, they have the ability to help you understand who your audience is, what they care about, on a very fine-grained way. You know, they could learn what you prefer, how you prefer to talk about things or learn about things. And they have the ability to converse. And so I think they can be useful both for the research about what are the opinions that are out there, how do they work, and then also they can be deployed essentially to at least introduce topics into the conversation. I'm not saying you necessarily change somebody's mind, but you know, a lot of the conversation that goes on in social media and on the internet is misleading or you know, yeah, like Stuart said, you get these sort of binary views of what's going on, and it's not accurate.
So I'm curious because I've done a little bit of work on misinformation, and I've looked into kind of the science behind how do you change someone's mind, right? Like, and everyone has this question, but at the end of the day, you can't change someone's mind by like assaulting them with information, really.
Right.
And that's not, in fact, what happens with misinformation. Usually, misinformation is like confirmation bias. It's just directing people in a more. But you can change someone's mind by listening and by asking them questions and by presenting kind of like a more human approach. And it usually happens between people or between friends or family, people that you already know or trust. I'm wondering if there's some kind of potential application, and I would love to see the FIRE community work on this, where you created a chatbot that gave you insight into your friends and family and their views and beliefs and how you might be able to listen and the questions to ask them to talk about these things.
I mean, I've actually been reading a lot of social science recently, and there's just fantastic work going on. You know, there's starting with like things about how people's beliefs and biases, you know, the Daniel Kahneman sort of stuff. But then there's work on incentives. There's work on how beliefs and behaviors propagate through networks. You know, by Damon Centola and Sandy Pentland. There's really exciting stuff happening in social networks. There's Jonathan Haidt has written very interestingly about different moral foundations that people like liberals and conservatives have, and it affects the way people see problems. And so I just think there's opportunity for AI to help us understand that kind of bias, and also to sort of pick apart the pieces and figure out which group do we direct this message to, what's most likely to change somebody's mind in a conversation. And there's a lot of other uses for it. I should also say it's being adopted very rapidly by the conservation community, and it's being used for essentially to get us closer to the sort of holy grail of real-time monitoring. It's being now used for animal communication, which is very exciting. We don't know where that's going.
Yeah.
A lot of work on.
And that would be which Roger was an advisor to, Daniela and Bruce at MIT, and David Gruber, who both have been at FIRE events in the past.
Yes. There's also work on recognizing individuals, which is really cool because it changes your whole perception of what's going on in an ecological community when you don't just say, oh, look, you know, another ray, a manta ray. You say, oh, that's that one that we saw this morning. And then one of the most exciting things I think is also the opportunities for law enforcement. And I was going to show one slide. I don't know if there's time for it, but
do we have that? Yeah, there we go.
This is a little think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. Actually, I don't know how little they are, but illegal fishing is an enormous problem. There's a Chinese fleet that numbers something like 10,000 ships, and they're ghost ships. They stay at sea, they refuel at sea, they transship. Nobody knows how many there are. And this little think tank put together this map of how all of these shell companies are related. And then the second map on the right shows that essentially one family controlled all of these shell companies, and they had very close ties to the Communist Party. And it turns out,
surprise!
Yeah, it turns out that was done not by the little think tank, but by Palantir, who aggregates data on a massive scale. And this was by trolling through financial reports, boring mid-level business stuff in Chinese, and they managed to put it together, and they discovered the main company was listed on the NASDAQ, and a month or two later, it's now delisted because of this work. So I think people who work on wildlife enforcement, I think there are a lot of opportunities there.
Yeah, and Andrea Crosta, who we've had at FIRE many times before, also has an international network that's focused on human trafficking and the intersection of animal trafficking and conservation.
Yeah.
Stuart, I'm curious. We have just a few. I want to take questions in about 4 minutes. So if you have questions, maybe start moving toward the mic. But I'm curious. You travel a lot around the world. John just talked about these Chinese fishing fleets. What, in your mind, are the biggest threats to conservation today?
Yeah, the biggest threats can be lumped into two big categories, and those would be the global and the local threats. Global threats, I think, is the elephant in the room, to use a nice ecological pun, or gorilla, I guess I could use. Which is climate change, of course. That's a fundamental problem. But local issues are really equally important. These are things like overexploitation, habitat degradation, and these things that we can manage locally. We have to address both of these issues for us to preserve any of these ecosystems. But one thing that I get really excited about is that with a little bit of protection today, we actually have a time horizon where we could see this regeneration of our ecosystems.
Awesome. All right, we have quite a few questions. So let's start on this side with Brenda.
Hi, I've been studying communication and AI and animals, and I believe that we're actually going to be able to make some significant progress. As that happens, how do you think understanding both communication between animals and cognition, which that's going to give us a window into, is going to change us as human beings?
That's a great question. I don't know. To me, when I was a kid, whales were basically just meat that was swimming around in the ocean, and they were thought of exactly like fish or something. You just harvest them to eat. And there's been such a transition in my lifetime, and I think that mental model of whales as just a resource it's hardly to even conceive of it anymore. Whaling is basically ended. And so I think if people start to recognize animals, that animals have, very much more ability to think and to see them as individuals, I think it's going to be very, very influential. I don't know where it'll go, but I'm hopeful.
It reminds me of those buttons that people are getting for their dogs,
yeah.
and the amount of language that a dog can learn just through these weird touch buttons. So we've finally invented after having dogs for hundreds and thousands of years. It's amazing. So I think I don't know if you want to.
No.
Okay, let's go over here.
Thank you. Great session. So I have a question actually for Stuart. So we heard quite a bit about drones and robots today, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what might be possible in terms of like physical actuators. So as you're using the digital twins to sort of sense and model the coral reefs, is part of that also deploying things like local cooling systems or cleaning systems? This is not my area, so I don't even know what's possible, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about the technologies that might be possible in that area.
Many. Let's talk at lunch for hours and hours about this. Now, the major things where we really have some huge opportunities is to really leverage some of the autonomous access. The underwater environment is just a tough place. Yeah. And when you think about the amount of information we have, we've just scratched the surface. If you have to depend upon me putting a tank on my back and going down, you're not going to be able to see very much. So we need to make that more autonomous. So the application of robotics just for sensing is hugely important. We have programs that are global, things like the Argo float program that tells us about ocean movements and temperatures with simple robotics. But we have the abilities to do sensing with robotics. Another really exciting one is in terms of some of the actions that we need to take. There will be restoration efforts. And now as we start imagining this ecosystem, just take a coral reef, or you could do kelp forest, anything coastal, there's kilometers and thousands, hundreds of thousands of kilometers that we have to work at. If we're going to do anything at scale, we have to get support. It cannot be done through volunteers and paid people. And building out these robotic tools that can plant corals, that can plant seaweeds, that can target particular organisms, it's exciting, it's terrifying as well to make sure that we do it right. So I do think there's a huge opportunity is to put more hands and more eyes in the water, and then to have us be able to experience it with some of these tools that you're talking about. How can we get into this metaverse? How can we experience it when we're in the water in addition to when we're not, so we can design our strategies?
I'm curious, so don't worry, we have another question over here we'll get to in just a second, but you and I have talked before about your desire to bring humans into the loop in assessing the health of coral through your image library, potentially through a game, and then using that to train an AI model to identify healthy versus unhealthy coral. Once that's done, are there specific fixes that you're seeing or health, like once we know that, then what?
Yeah, right. There's never going to be one answer. The world is continually evolving.
Can you give me one example?
There will be types of corals that will do better in new environments under new environmental systems. We see that with forests and grasslands. As the water keeps moving, you get different species coming in. We're going to see this evolution of the type of a coral reef ecosystem. In that one side of your answer, or the answer of what is a coral reef, it's a high diversity system, beautiful types of things. Well, it's because they live in different types of environments. As the environment's changing, we need to have the right organism in the right place. If we wait for this to happen naturally through dispersal and such, we'll be waiting generations, human generations. And for us to be a little bit more proactive to maintain some of these ecosystems this generation, we're going to have to accelerate that process.
It reminds me of the indigenous kind of farming of tide pools in Hawaii. All right, well, question over here from John.
Yeah, quick question. So there's actually a report that came out in June that I participated in from the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's at Biosecurity, helenabiosecurity.org, which addresses some of the issues of responsible AI and synthetic biology. So my question for you is, do you have a framework, given how rapidly extinctions are occurring now, do you have a framework for thinking about how and in what circumstance you physically accelerate the distribution versus provide some synthetic biology solutions that provide more heat tolerance to existing species so that we don't lose them altogether before it's too late? Do you have a framework for how you think about that dichotomy?
Personally, yes, but in terms of practice, it's national and regional. The regulations and such are hyper variable from geography to geography. We see that we can look in the coral example, you go across the Caribbean. Caribbean's a heavily populated area filled with 100 islands or so. Some islands, the governments say it's fine to move organisms around. Let's keep this system around. So the replanting and the cross and these genetic solutions are embraced. Other places you can't move an organism more than a kilometer, which is just ludicrous if we're going to do this migration. It's going to happen. At the same time, we see invasive species filling the environment. The lionfish is a big problem, is having spread across the Caribbean. We're happy to kill those, but we're not happy to rebuild. So the framework, I think, is something we need to invest in, but this is where it gets into the political side of things, making sure we get community consensus, that it's built from community interests, but then to be able to facilitate that conversation and then enact it. And it's just very challenging in the political and legal frameworks that we currently have. But thank you for addressing that, because it's terrifically important.
All right, I think that's about all we have time for this conversation. We do have a special guest who's coming out on stage. Some of you may recognize him from such places as Fire.
Hey.
Hello. So we're going to talk about Roger. I'm going to talk about Roger.
Go
and
for it.
John. And I wanted to tell you something you don't know, I don't think, to start out. This is like a series of pictures in my memory. I went to your house, and you were probably like, you know, and I knew Ellie Dorsey, and she was working for Roger. And when I think of Roger, I think of like two things. One is teaching, always teaching.
Yep.
And the other one is music, always music. And so it was lunchtime. I'm in this kind of sunny Florida room thing with your dad and your mom.
Yeah.
And they're having lunch. I just broke in, kind of. And you were probably there having lunch, too.
Yeah.
I didn't recognize you as John at the time. And Ellie was there, and she was in this library, working in this library of all the songs.
Yeah.
Talk about a magic room.
Yeah.
All the whale songs. It was the coolest thing, you know. It's like, you sometimes will be, in your life, you go like, oh, this is a cool thing.
Yeah.
And that was a really amazing thing. It was like the first library of whale language, and it was beautifully done.
Yeah.
So Roger was talking about music. And I think, he played what? Cello?
Cello, yeah.
So he was involved with chamber music, and so we're all kind of talking about that. And then, typical of Roger, kind of an indication of a combination of how smart he was and creatively smart. So I'm talking about whale sounds in orca, killer whales, and so many frequencies, up to 100,000, whatever. And and the brains and he goes, it's kind of weird. At those frequencies, the nerve doesn't conduct fast enough in the brain. And I'm thinking, I'm still today wondering what the hell that means, I do not understand that point, but it was a great point. Someone's going to have to work on it. Maybe you have to work on it.
Yeah.
So I just kind of got my first taste. And then, of course, we all know Roger made these recordings, and he made himself and the whales famous in 1 minute when Geographic put him into the National Geographic magazine. They were in plastic. Everyone got one. There were millions, I think.
I think it's still the largest pressing of any record in history.
Holy moly.
Like yeah.
So we all got one. And just to listen to them, the picture's worth 1,000 words, a whale song's worth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was just completely inspiring, I think, for the world.
Yeah.
Instead of telling people, these are cool animals, just listen to this. And it worked. That was so smart,
Yeah.
That was just teacher smart. And then, of course, he wrote a beautiful book, which changed my life completely. And Minds in the Water, and it was with a co-author. And it had everything. If you were interested in whales and dolphins, that was your book. It broke every kind of record in terms of engagement and science, and treat them with respect, and it's biological and scientific.
Yeah.
So that really got me going into whales myself. And then one of the things I did because of him was then I got this job on a tall ship. I went down from Boston to the Caribbean. I was recording whale songs.
Yeah.
I recorded the longest, I think, ever recorded, a 27-hour-long recording of whale songs down in the Banks.
Which ship were you on?
I was on the Regina Maris.
Regina Maris.
Yeah, you know the ship, right?
Yes.
This is beautiful.
It's a death trap.
It was. Yeah, it was beautiful, but it was a death trap. It was dangerous, really.
It really was.
Yeah, it was.
My brother was on it later, and he said there was always, the pumps were working as hard as they could all the time.
All the time.
And the bilge was electrified, so that when the engineer went down to work on stuff, he was getting shocked continuously
Wow.
at kind of a low level.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I happen to know that when it went into dry dock, which was more than the owner wanted, right?
Yeah.
All they do was it was all copper plated on the outside, and as soon as you removed a little copper plate, that was going to be $60,000 because there was so much rot behind that it was just a copper plate that was holding the whole thing together. Yeah.
That's funny.
It was a very exciting time. And then later we started Orca Relief, and then Roger, of course, became our first advisor at Orca Relief. And that became the most important thing about saving, I think, the orca whales in that population.
Yeah.
And he was kind enough to come out and speak for us and raise money and all that kind of stuff. And meanwhile, Ellie who I had mentioned a minute ago, had left there and come to the West Coast, and she began the first minke whale program to become the longest longitudinal minke whale program in history, still running now, right?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Still running now. And then on and on. And finally, I have this picture of Roger being here, and I have this picture in my kitchen. And he's talking about the ocean, right? So he goes on and on, on and on. You know, you've heard this.
Oh, yes.
We've all heard this before. It's like, this is really bad news, guys. Take care of the ocean. And at the end, it's very quiet, and it's question time. And the picture I have is of Evan, who's about 14, coming up to one of these mics. And we'd just been told, don't eat fish, okay? Just stop it. Yeah. And Evan says, Dr. Payne, then what are we supposed to eat? And, you know, he thinks about it seriously, and he goes, well, I recommend very lean, ranch-raised, you know, grass-fed beef. And the whole team of S&S Fire went to lunch. Now, we had already had 5 lunches at that hotel, and everybody was eating, you know, and suddenly it's like all they had was lean beef for lunch. So he was teaching like with every single thing he did. Yeah. It was wonderful, truly wonderful. So I could go on a lot longer, but when I think of him, in summary, I kind of, you know, I think of him as the protector of oceans, not just whales, but oceans, and the lover of music, and teacher of us all.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Yeah.
So in honor of Roger, if we have that up, in honor of Roger, that was a password. There we go. We have talked, as you know, among ourselves, and the team here decided we'd like to create this honorary program called the Roger Payne Animal Ambassador Program. And what it means is we'll have somebody here every year at Fire in his honor speaking about animal welfare, animal communications, animal conservation.
That's lovely. Yeah, thank you. He would be very pleased.
Yeah, he would.